welcome to Women's Human Rights Campaign meeting on women's sex-based rights. Women's Human Rights Campaign is the leading global NGO campaigning to defend women's sex-based rights. The main focus of Women's Human Rights Campaign is on defending women's sex-based rights against the threats posed by gender identity ideology. You can find more information on our website, womensdeclaration.com, where you will find our Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, which has been signed by 16,028 people from 130 countries and is supported by 317 organisations. Today, I'm really pleased to say that we are going to be hearing from Claudine Letsae from the UK. She's a feminist and an activist. Tamanda Godson from Tanzania. She's a feminist scholar and writer. Vanessa Vokey from Canada, a photographer, artist, and radfem YouTuber. And Sheila Jeffreys from the UK, radical lesbian feminist author and activist. Claudine, we were hoping to hear back from the NGO CSW what your ideas were, what you did, what you saw, what the point of the event was, and how you experienced it. So what did you think, Claudine?
Oh, fantastic. And thank you so much for offering me this opportunity to actually speak about my experience. I mean, this was the first time I'd actually attended the NGO CSW, which is a committee on the status of women as rights. It was an important, I would say, and an interesting opportunity, as well as actually seeing how the UN works around the NGOs. I remember one person when I was studying telling me that actually, so the NGOs actually have sort of like a separate area where they meet, and the rest of actually the UN kind of carries on with their business. So now I actually have a clearer understanding that actually that is the case. You know, you don't actually get in there and be able to actually influence the changes, but you're more like on the sidelines. You're actually given opportunities in that way. So for me, my experience has been quite enlightening. You know, I was heartened to actually hear that actually over 25,000 women actually had registered. The important thing is actually recognizing that, you know, the NGOs have been there for a long time that have been engaged with this. This was the 65th event, which was an important one, because as we know now, there are issues around women's rights that actually needs to be discussed. So from my events that I attended, there were loads of them that I managed to attend. I missed the consultation day, unfortunately, but the most important ones, I tried to actually have an attendance on those. And I recognized that there were separation on areas around the world. So you had like the Latin American and the Caribbean Consultation Day, you had the African Day, so forth. So there was meant to actually be an exhibit wall for actually all those areas that actually are covered. But the stagnant thing that I actually recognized was that, you know, there wasn't actually much representation from countries that are actually more isolated, you know, like for Africa. You had very few NGOs that actually were involved in this. So the places where you're having more of the gender-based violence, there's less what you would call engagement from those countries where women are actually saying these are the problems, this is how they need to actually be resolved. And there seemed to actually have been no information on how women, generally women, actually can actually influence policies and actually ensure that, you know, the Istanbul Convention goes ahead. If there's any changes, actually they are actually fully represented. So that seems to me quite issues that I thought, you know, this is important to actually have women understanding how these sessions work as well as the UN work. So I attended one of the most interesting ones, obviously being a woman of color. So I attended a few women of color events. I actually don't like the name woman of color, but it's a Black woman. So, and this was actually by the NACCP, which was actually Black Women Anti-Black Racism, Climate Change in the US. Although it was in the US, I actually felt, well, maybe I need to actually understand what what this is all about and how it's actually impacting women, obviously in the US, but actually there were lots of other people that were there. So what I would find in these events, that it didn't actually seem to matter where you were in the world. So if you were interested in an event, which was mostly the parallel events, you would actually go in and actually attend those. But the most problematic thing that I found was that actually most of the ones that actually are UN based were consultations, that it was virtually impossible for people to be able to actually attend as normal members who would actually join in. So that for me was something that I felt actually it shouldn't have been the case. There should be an opportunity for people to be, women in particular, to be fully consulted, and actually having had an online event offered an opportunity where the UN could have actually engaged better with women, that they actually had like their say. So I would like to see an opportunity. I mean, I hope that actually the WHRC would be able to actually push for such a consultation of women, because the decisions that are made in these environments are actually being made by people that don't seem to actually have grassroots connections with women at all. So I would urge all women that are active, even if you're not active, even if you're here by chance, it's an opportunity for you to actually be aware of the deficit that are available in these platforms that are making decisions around women's rights and that are impacting women across the world. So CEDAW is actually quite important. The Istanbul Convention is important. And we've also just learned that Turkey has literally decided to stop actually being part of the Istanbul Convention, which really protects women. In this country, in Turkey, there are 3 women murdered every day. I mean, I don't even want to talk about other issues around gender violence for women. That is absolutely upsetting. I mean, I can actually sit there and think, what is happening? Why are we going backwards on the rights of women instead of actually moving forward to support women? So I really, really, really urge all people, in particular, as we say, if there are men here, allies, so go out, find out about these things so that then you can support women in your life. Make people aware of the rights of women that are actually being taken away by all sorts of manner of things that actually are occurring at the moment. So we need to really just force forward and actually think how things are being made. So the thing that was also significant for me, I saw quite a lot of universities actually quite involved in the NGO space. So this is a space that seems to actually have like kind of the select few people that are actually putting themselves forward and saying to be representing women, which I actually generally, I mean, on my personal thing, and probably people that know me, I have a huge issue with NGOs because they don't always represent people that they say they represent, and they have kind of a disproportionate voice in actually espousing what actually they think is right or wrong. And as we know, there's a lot of policy capture in NGOs, in particular the larger NGOs, where actually the rights of women are being put backwards. And they're not on the forefront of decisions. And it's actually good to really see the changes. The only changes that are going to happen, in my view, is when women are actually taking into consideration what is happening and taking the fight towards these bodies that are actually meant to be saying they represent women. And actually, in a sense, if you look at it, they do not represent women at all.
We, as Women's Human Rights Campaign, are worried about the threat of gender identity ideology taking away some women's rights, or being a threat. Do you think the CSW was tackling this issue? Are they concerned about it, or do you think most of the attendees? I mean, there were 25,000 there. What sort of feeling did you get from the other attendees and from the workshops?
From my personal view, from what I actually saw, from most of the events I attended, that didn't seem to be any concept that actually was seen as a problem, which is actually quite worrying. Because, if you go around all over the world, there seems to be a move to actually remove, language, change language to actually fit, a narrative, to change, the identification of a woman, which is actually quite interesting. But all these were not seemingly the basis of discussion. Most of the things that were being discussed were around gender issues, and obviously the most parallel events were hosted and sponsored by the NGOs themselves. So you can see where this is going. My view is that actually we need to specifically really attend to the crucial, I would say, the crucial position of women and womanhood that's actually seemed to be under attack by, what do you call it, gender ideology, from all sides, really. So we really have to be protecting women's rights in a way, but my urging women to get involved. I mean, there's been an agreed wedding of the 65th event. So please go and look at that. So find out if there's anything that's actually worrying on there. But best of all, I'm in the UK. I would like to see our government doing something really radical to make sure that actually the CEDAW is actually enacted, Istanbul Convention is actually sort of enacted, and protecting women. With the recent events of Sarah, and everybody's aware of that. Women are being technically written out of history by all sorts, but we need to actually really be fighting for that. So I urge all women to actually really be aware. These are the things that are worrying, and we need to be active. We can't all sit back and say, well, there's nothing that's happening. We have to be actively involved in actually deciding what the bodies that are meant to be protecting us. I mean, it's been 65 years. I mean, it tells you 65 years since CEDAW, but there hasn't been much changes. So it really is actually quite worrying. And there's been a huge gender-based violence. The changes in Europe, in certain countries in Europe, other than Turkey, there is a move to really just not actually consider the issues around women's rights, as well as actually protecting them. And, we hope that people would actually be thinking along those lines and seeing how they can, make a difference. Inform yourself. It's no longer an excuse to not be informed. You need to look and find out the information and make sure that you are active in your community, and hold all the politicians, all the people to account for actually protecting women. Because it's not enough to say, oh, we are dealing with women's rights. It's not enough, because the women's rights are under attack. So we have to actually take a stance and say no. Just my last thoughts. I mean, there's loads of events I attended, and I didn't want to actually concentrate on that, because that would actually take away from, the idea that actually this is meant to be a woman's opportunity to raise the issues that they experience. But my experience of it has been kind of the opposite, where self-selected groups have actually chosen to actually present things at the UN. So I think actually the most important thing that the WHRC can do is really mobilize grassroots women to actually really be aware what's happening in these bodies that are actually meant to represent their views and push for changes across, multinationally, so across all nations. So it's such an important platform that can really ensure that, protection of women's rights, it's at the heart of the people that are mainly tasked to actually look after the protection of women. So I would actually really urge women to really take that as a message from me, to really become active around issues that impact women. And remember, we have achieved things in the West, but in countries that are still under suppression of patriarchy, it's worse. We've moved from a position where it's really worse, and our NGOs, the funding that's actually being given to NGOs is facilitating the destruction on women's rights. And I think that's one thing that I just want to put forward as a crying call for women. There's a saying in my language, my other language, is watinta abafazi, watinti mbogodo, meaning when you touch women, you are really touching the stone that actually holds everything together. So we really have to get on and really protect women across the world, not just really in areas that we are actually interested in. So that is my crying call for women to take up arms and really fight. It's time to fight. It's not time to be nice.
Okay, so we're going to now move to Tamanda Godson from Tanzania. She's a feminist scholar and writer. And welcome, thank you so much for coming. Tamanda has signed the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. So my first question for you, Tamanda, is how did you become interested in women's rights and why did you sign the Women's Human Rights Campaign Declaration?
I've always been interested in women's rights. I grew up in a misogynistic community, so I was always aware that women weren't treated fairly. But I guess I can say I learned about feminism as a political movement while I was still in high school. I remember looking for a book to read in the school library and came across a book by Alice Walker. I didn't know who she was. I was just stunned to see a book written by a Black woman at the time. I remember her picture was on the back of the book. And as I took it home and read it from cover to cover, I decided to Google her. And once I did Google her, it came up, I came to find the word feminism and womanism, what they were, and that these were all viable political movements and that women, and they were basically set up for women's rights. So I signed the declaration because the conversation is being had in some parts of the world and it's slowly finding its way into the Tanzanian consciousness. Women here are still struggling to maintain our rights as it is. So with the erosion of sex-based rights happening in other parts of the world, in my mind, I can see it coming here pretty soon because the discussion is already there. So I just figured signing the declaration would be a good move forward into protecting those sex-based rights.
What affects Tanzanian women's lives in general?
Well, like most places in the world, I think economics is the most important thing. Tanzania is a low-income country with nearly half its population living in poverty. The face of poverty in Africa, not just Tanzania, is a woman. Women historically have been barred from fully participating on platforms that aid people out of poverty. There's still a very strong belief that men are providers and they single-handedly should be responsible for the sustenance of the family. The mindset is slowly changing here in the cities, but it's still prevalent in rural areas. Work and money is gendered with men encouraged to go for highly skilled, high-earning jobs, while women are encouraged to go for the opposite. It is fairly common for men in rural areas to actively sabotage women in business in an attempt to keep social cohesion. Land is very important to the Tanzanian people because most of us are farmers. Both men and women alike till the land, but land is mostly owned by men. Men still own the majority of the land, despite the fact that a law was passed in 1999, which enabled women to equally inherit and own land. But by the time the law was passed, all the land already belonged to men, and there is customary law that protects men and allows them to strictly pass on their inheritance to their sons. In some cases, women do inherit land from their fathers, but then are stripped of the land by their brothers and uncles. It's even worse for wives. Once your spouse passes on, she and her children are often kicked out of the marital home she shared with her husband by her late husband's extended family. The land belongs to men, women belong to men. So if you don't have a man in Tanzania, you're basically considered a destitute woman. Another reason is that men decide the type of jobs women can do, which are mostly low-wage, unskilled labor that men don't want to do themselves. Which leads me to my second point, which is the cultural belief that Tanzanians have that men are the leaders of the household and thus are divinely ordained to create rules for women because of the belief that women are children unable to govern themselves. This belief is strongly rooted in religion, with people quoting the Bible or Quran as a reference as to why women cannot govern themselves. Religion plays a strong role in female oppression. Tanzania is a deeply religious state with its population divided into either Christianity or Islam. You find women who might have escaped the typical trappings of poverty or gender-based violence hold themselves back from decision-making due to religious beliefs. Education is also not prioritized for girls. Families would rather prioritize the education of boys, being that they are more likely to acquire high-earning careers and financially support the family. 1 in 3 girls in Tanzania have never attended any type of schooling compared to boys, which is 1 in 4. School-age girls may be barred by the government from attending school if by chance they fall pregnant. Teenage pregnancy is quite high in Tanzania, with about 21% of girls aged 15 to 19 dropping out of school because of motherhood, with the figure rising up to 45% in some areas of the country. Statistics are made worse by Tanzania's conservative view of sex abortion rights for women. All abortion rights for women have all been outlawed by the government due to religious reasons. The child marriage rate is more than 35% nationally. There is a cultural push for girls and women to marry young, which then curbs the ability to be independent and capable of making their own decisions. Ultimately, Tanzanian women are yet to come to the realization of their own value, that we are just as capable of living full lives and making decisions as our male counterparts.
Are there any women's rights activists or LGB groups in Tanzania, and what work are they doing?
There's quite a few women's rights groups here in Tanzania, actually. The public is aware of the rights of women due to ongoing awareness campaigns, and Tanzania's reputation for women's rights has improved over the past 2 decades. Girls are 40% more likely to be educated, at least at the primary level today, than they were 20 years ago. There's also a significant rise in women's economic status and women-owned businesses. Our current president is a woman, though she wasn't actually voted in. And I can confidently say that the successes women have had has been due to ongoing campaigns by the various women's groups. A well-known agency here called Msichana Initiative was able to get the government to set the legal age of marital consent at 18 in 2016. Before this, there was no age of consent, and as a result, 3 in every 10 girls would be married off before the age of 18. The initiative's main work is to help protect girls from child marriage and assist young girls in getting an education. They routinely do awareness drives to areas that are most affected by child marriage and try to educate girls and their families on the dangers of child marriage. We have seen a significant decrease of child marriages since the law was changed in 2016. Female genital mutilation was a practice deeply entrenched in Tanzanian culture, but it is also one of the main misogynistic cultural practices that the government, together with women's rights media groups, worked hard to eradicate. It has taken at least 2 decades worth of media campaigning to successfully change cultural views on FGM. The rate of FGM has gone down from 18 to about 10% since 1998, when it was criminalized. I personally remember being in school and having talks about what to do if you find yourself in a threatening situation linked to FGM. Girls are aware of it being a criminal act and are encouraged to report abuses if they see it happening. We also have a few legal groups who offer their services to the public pro bono in an effort to combat injustice. Most women in Tanzania do not have a working knowledge of how law and enforcement works, let alone the finances it takes to take a case to court. Women are groomed into believing that when something criminal is done to them or against them, it's simply the plight of women and it can go no further. These legal groups, such as the Tanzanian Women's Lawyer Association, are responsible for getting women the assistance they need when dealing with cases that affect us as a demographic. Their main efforts is to assist women with land and property rights, domestic violence, rape, and child support cases. The LGBT community is under threat in Tanzania. Whatever presence it had in terms of advocacy has been more or less eradicated in the past 5 years. The government began an anti-LGBT campaign around 2017, where it denounced gay rights, despite the fact Tanzania is a member and subscriber of the United Nations Human Rights Declaration. The government does not comply with its international human rights obligations and provides no protection against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. In addition, homosexuality is criminalized in sections 154 to 157 of Tanzania's Penal Code, and the state does not recognize marriage equality rights for all couples, regardless of sex, sexual orientation, or gender identity. LGBT advocates are routinely threatened and harassed by the police, and homosexual relations are punishable by death in Tanzania. In 2018, a so-called witch hunt was declared against gay people in Dar es Salaam, where suspected gay men were forced to endure anal examinations and torture at the hands of the government. Public perception of the 2018 witch hunt was mostly supportive of the governmental efforts. LGBT rights aren't in the public conscious, and as of now, we do not see any improvement for the members of that community.
I'm interested in, where do you get your information? Like, for you personally and women like you, do you sort of move around the whole internet, or do you get it from books, or where are your sort of sites that you look at?
Well, both, because we're pretty connected in terms of the internet, so we have access to everything. Well, that's the one thing about Tanzania. We have access to what's going on in the world. We have access to pretty much whatever everybody else is having access to. But then a bit of a problem that we might have is the actual books and the actual conversations being had with people in maybe schools or politically. The conversation when it comes to women's rights is just not really there. It's there on a surface level where the government tries to talk about it, tries to get women in political places, but it's not really actually being had by the actual people on the ground.
Do you know if the laws, do you know if there are any transgender identity laws in your country, or is it, because we have in lots of European countries, the governments are trying to change the law to say, if you have a gender identity, you can say legally you are the opposite sex. Is that happening in Tanzania?
No, not at all. I remember there was a time where the government was being pressured by foreign bodies to kind of make it a law in some ways within our constitution. But the government, like, it's part of the reason why they kind of shut down LGBT rights as well, because this whole transgender thing was coming in and they just kind of felt like it was maybe all too much. And then that's when the laws kind of just completely shut down the transgender talk. But then because of that, they also kind of made it law that, LGBT people cannot have any rights in Tanzania as well. So no, we don't have that right now. Women's rights is getting better here in Africa in general. It's just moving at a very slow pace. And each country, depending on its own laws and its own history, is making different strides with it. At this point, I can say that when it comes to basic things like, owning property and owning, being able to get an education and a woman making her own decisions, most African women are able to do that. It just changes once a woman decides that she wants to get married. And now it's kind of like, on a cultural level, she belongs to her husband. So the problem right now, as far as I see it, at least here in Tanzania, in the cities, it's women have rights and they are aware of it, but that kind of changes once they just get married. So, the idea of women's rights once she's married is more relevant for us now here in Tanzania in the cities.
We're now going to go to Vanessa Vokey. She's from Canada. She's a photographer, artist, and radfem YouTuber. And she's going to talk to us about her experience of being cancelled and about her YouTube channel.
Basically, I started working at a vegan restaurant. And while I was working there, I got let go and basically confronted by my boss because I had been posting, gender identity, ideology criticism on my Facebook page. And because I was let go from that job, I made this design that says, "I heart J.K. Rowling, woman equals adult human female," which was very much inspired by Posey Parker's billboard that she put up in Liverpool and in, I think, the London Tube. And when I posted the design on Instagram, right away I got messaged by a local photographer who I'd never met before. I've done family and wedding photos for about 7 years, and she just messaged me saying, what's the message of your shirt? And I said, it's the message that it says on the shirt. And she said, but are trans women women? And I said, trans women are men. And then she just put me on her story and said, this person is transphobic, like go and report her, or this is awful, whatever. Basically just trying to publicly shame me. And it just kind of snowballed. About 15 minutes later, I was posted on like 15 stories, 20 stories, 50 stories, 100 stories. And because of that, because of all this negative attention, I decided to go on YouTube and tell my side of the story. And when I made a video, I made a video saying I was canceled for transphobia, and this is my side of the story. And I explained that the reason that I'm concerned is because of the same reasons that all of the women on this phone call are concerned about gender identity ideology, which is that women have already had to struggle for our rights, and this is just another setback. So when I made my videos, I got a big reaction from people saying, this is great. I don't feel like I'm crazy anymore. People were very surprised to see a Canadian person speaking out about this as well, because Canadian people are often seen as very like polite and not willing to rock the boat and just want to be considerate of everyone's feelings. But I was just very blunt and honest about how I feel, which is that I'm angry about the women being harassed just for stating biological facts, right? So after I started making videos, some people made me aware of guy named Samantha Lux, who is a transsexual YouTuber who has a very young audience, where he makes videos criticizing feminists, basically just excusing men in women's sports, saying men in women's prisons is okay, just awful, awful stuff. So people said to me, why don't you make a video about this guy? And I thought, okay. And I made a video kind of highlighting that he made 2 videos about his bottom surgery. Bottom surgery is obviously a euphemistic term for sexual reassignment surgery, I guess, which is also a euphemistic term for penile inversion, which is what this young man did, where he got a surgery to invert his penis into, a hole that could potentially, or like an orifice that could potentially be used for intercourse with a penis. And he was claiming that he now had a vagina. And obviously I had a problem with that. So I started to kind of do some more research about this procedure, about some of the misconceptions that people had about it, about kind of, I showed a way that he was contradicting himself in 2 different videos where he was speaking about his procedure, but in very different light and in very different terms. And I think that the main reason I wanted to make the video was to kind of goad him into making a response. I thought it would be interesting to see if I could kind of lay all these little traps to show that he didn't know anything about women's biology, and that he didn't care about women's rights and women's sex-based oppression. And it was very successful. He made a video about me that now has 1.1 million views. It's the 5th most viewed video on his channel. So, thanks. And what ended up happening was he basically, kind of made me into this star, and a bunch of people, just jumped on board with me and started supporting me and saying, this is great. You're finally speaking truth to these men, and saying, no, I'm not going to coddle you. I'm not going to say she and her when I know that you're obviously a male. And of course, I've gotten a lot of hate. I've gotten a lot of targeted harassment from this person's, like this Samantha Lux person's fandom, because the way that young people operate now, especially stans, which is basically a word for obsessed fans, is that they see bullying and harassment as virtue signaling and woke points. Like they get social status from bullying people online, which is a very big discrepancy from how bullying and online bullying was seen when I was younger. So recently I made a couple posts on Twitter and Instagram, saying to this Samantha Lux person, hey, like, let's debate, because I don't think you belong in any female single sex spaces. And I think that just really put him over the edge. And he sent all of his fans to come and report my account, report my videos for hate speech. And eventually, YouTube just took down my account. They do give you strikes, but the strikes only last for 90 days or something. So you cannot post for 90 days and then you can get your channel back. But they just didn't even let me do that, because they let someone report a video that I had already posted. So my YouTube channel was removed. I have started a new channel. While this was all happening, my Twitter account got suspended. And it was really interesting because this Samantha Lux person tweeted, "Karma is lit," which is basically him gloating about my YouTube channel getting taken down. And I responded to him and said, "You've already gotten your karma. You cut your own dick off." And apparently that was reported as a threat of like violence, which I'm like, how is it a threat to point out what you've already elected to do to yourself? But worth it, I think, because I made my point and a lot of people saw it before my account got suspended. But again, I have an old Twitter account, so I'm still on Twitter. You can find me. I'm never gonna go away. Like, I'm just gonna keep moving around, and just keep kind of trying to stir the pot and get more people involved in the conversation, regardless of whatever side you come from. I think we can all laugh at the absurdity of the situation, and I think that's kind of what I try to do, is bring more to light of the absurdity of these men and the things they claim, and the declaration, the oppression they claim. It's just hilarious and absurd. So I try to be the person that's like pointing out that the emperor is not wearing any clothes. And I think that's why they had to cancel me, because I was doing it too effectively.
Where is your new channel? So where can people?
So I started a new channel and I just called it Tomboy for Life, like LYFE. And my profile picture is the photo that I posted kind of mocking Ellen Page when she posted the photo wearing the toque and the hoodie and her glasses, because I just thought this is brilliant. I have to post a picture like this. So people can find me on there.
YouTube as well, or is it somewhere else?
No, it's on YouTube as well.
So you're allowed to, even though you've been banned, you're allowed to set up a new one?
Yeah.
That's great. And did you save all your old videos?
Yeah. So I've got a hard drive here, so I've got almost all of them on there, and I think there was maybe one that I don't have, and there's a couple people that have backed up everything because they're smart and they know. And I plan on uploading them to like Vimeo as well, you know, like I just haven't gotten around to it yet because uploading videos takes a lot of time.
Can you tell us a bit about this moving around?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's what we're sort of thinking, that we've been banned a little bit from YouTube. They've taken down one of our videos, and we're sort of thinking that we'll probably have to do this moving around. But can you tell me how that works?
So I mean, basically the main thing I think with YouTube and with Twitter and all these other places is that they can suspend you for posting content that other people just don't like, because that's basically what I was suspended for. I never used hate speech. I never advocated violence against anyone. That's a very specific, you know, accusation to level against me, that I use hate speech. I just said things that hurt people's feelings, and that's supposed to be the same thing. And then the other part of it is that they can report you and you can appeal, but it's really all up to that one YouTube person, whoever is working for YouTube, whoever's moderating it in that moment, whoever the real human whose eyes are watching your content and like appealing, during the appealing process. It's really just up to them and what they politically believe and where they stand ideologically. And for the most part, they're all pro-trans because they're, you know, they work in IT, and a lot of them probably are trans identified. I think you can tell from like radfem accounts who don't even post content, but just subscribe to people like me and Burry Rose and LA Androphobia and other radfem YouTubers and just comment on the videos. Their accounts were even deleted this weekend. So there's something very nefarious going on when it comes to these platforms, singling out feminists and women who are pointing out the absurdity and the insidiousness of this gender identity extremism.
And Vanessa, a question I have, in your reading, do you think that they, what's motivating them? What do you think they actually think? Let's say this YouTube person who's sitting deleting your channel.
I think that they think that I think that there's two minds of it, right? There's the smart people who know what's going on and they're profiting from it, right? Like the corporate billionaires and the social media. I think they are kind of hand in hand. I think they're in this together to groom young kids to be a part of this social experiment. So there's that. And then I think there's also the people, like the actual people reporting me. There's two minds of it. I think there's the young teens who are reporting me because they genuinely think that I'm perpetuating violence against trans people by misgendering them because they're so brainwashed and naive, basically. And then there's the autogynephilic men who are reporting me because I'm raining on their parade so spectacularly and kind of chipping away at the facade that they've built up for themselves, and waking women up and piquing women to the insidiousness, like I said, of these men. And one of the things that I really want to focus on too is in gender critical circles, like even there's still women that are, oh, like Blair White is a she and blah, and I'm like, you gotta just be serious here, and you gotta understand that you can't make exceptions for people just because they agree with you on certain things. Like there is the truth, there is male and female, and Blair White is a male, so using she her pronouns for him is completely hypocritical if you're going to go ahead and criticize other people using pronouns. So I think that there's still a lot that needs to be done to peak women and younger people. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do, is like reach people who already kind of feel, there's something a little bit wrong here, right? Because I think we can all feel that there's a tidal wave of, detransitioners coming forward. There's all of this stuff happening with Rachel Levine in the United States as the health secretary, denying Rand Paul's questions about puberty blockers for kids. There's the Curabell Tavistock case. There's so many things now that are coming out and happening that I think a lot more people are sort of waking up to being like, men and women's sports, I just don't think that I'm really okay with that. And if you can show them, not only is it just this little thing you're not okay with, it's all this other stuff that you don't even know is happening. And I think like one of the reasons I think this is really insidious is because I had made a second channel because I knew my first YouTube channel was going to get taken down. And I only uploaded 2 videos to the second channel, but that one was still taken down for repeated violations. And the only video, one of the videos I had uploaded, was my speech about the men in women's prisons. And I think that is insanely insidious, because one of the main things I said in the video was, the media doesn't want you to know about this because it doesn't suit their narrative that anyone can just choose who they are. That's not true. We are who we are, and men face different challenges and women face different challenges, and that's fine. But like, this is not okay. Women in men's prison, or men in women's prisons, is not okay. Like, this is a damnation of our country, and how little they care about women. They don't care about women's safety. They care about men's feelings more. And so that was taken down for hate speech or whatever. So this is what they want to silence. They really don't want women pointing out exactly what's going on. So every time they remove a video, it just proves that we're fighting back effectively and that we're a threat. I think what needs to be done moving forward is less infighting amongst people who are fighting for the same thing. I've gotten a lot of grief for supporting creators who are more traditional, and support traditional gender roles and are conservative and Christian and blah, 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 blah. But my whole thing is, do we agree on reality? Are we fighting for the same thing? We might have slightly different motivations, but our motivations are pure, which is that we don't want kids learning this garbage. We don't want kids having their bodies medicalized because they feel confused or because they're autistic. And I think, the argument that some people make is that, feminists can't be straight or can't associate with men or have to separate from men. I don't think that that's fair. I think there's also, I have concerns about how to protect male children from male violence, because I don't necessarily trust men around children. You know what I mean? So I think that there's a conversation to be had about protecting male children as a part of feminism, but it's like, where's the cutoff, right? But I think that there's a lot of issues when it comes to like genital mutilation and genital cutting. I just watched a really excellent documentary / play by Eric Klopper, who was fired from Harvard for doing this really informative talk about male circumcision and the implications that has on male sexuality and on female sexuality. So I kind of want to bring attention and awareness to that, even though people may not feel that male circumcision is a feminist issue. As a straight woman, I know the difference between the two, and I know that I know from my own experience, men that are intact have a way better sexuality. They're not as they have more enjoyment, and I think that and also women have more enjoyment from it as well. There's a reason why we evolved to have sex the way that we did. Like Sheila was saying, some people, I've heard of stories like that before, especially like conservative Christian people trying to conceive and not really getting how to do that. And so I think that there is like this natural equipment that we've been given, and what a lot of men have been robbed of their natural equipment, and then are left hobbled sexually. And I think there's a lot of implications for that when it comes to pornography usage, when it comes to masturbation, when it comes to objectifying women, like seeing sex as just kind of a masturbatory act instead of a mutual exchange of pleasure and connection and all that kind of stuff. I think there's a lot to talk about when it comes to female and male sexuality and how it can be healthy and it can be rewarding and can be good for both partners. But I think that there's so much work that has to be done to get there. Like Sheila was saying, there's so much conditioning and there's so much socialization of women to be subordinate and to not prioritize their own pleasure in their relationship or in their sexuality. So yeah, I think there's a lot of conversations that can be had there.
Now we're going to go to Sheila Jeffreys. So Sheila's from the UK. She's a radical lesbian feminist author and activist. And she's going to talk today for about 30 minutes, up to 30 minutes, on the social construction of gender, of sexuality, social construction of sexuality. And there'll be 15 minutes at the end for questions. So if you have questions, put them in the Q&A so they don't get lost as the chat scrolls down. If you have questions that you'd like Sheila to answer, put them in the Q&A and then we'll try to get to them. Welcome, Sheila Jeffreys.
Hello, everybody. Yes, so today I'm going to talk about the importance of understanding social construction. The feminist campaign against the intrusion of men with female gender identities into the category of women is based on our understanding of social construction. We know that what these men call gender and see as innate consists of socially constructed sex stereotypes of what women are and how women should behave. The idea of social construction then is vital to what we do and was a vital founding understanding of the feminist movement in the 1970s and beyond. It's a puzzle to find that the understanding of social construction within our new and emerging movement does not always extend to gender in relation to some lesbians calling themselves butch, for instance, or to sexuality. There has been a profound move back to biological explanations of human sexual behavior in the last couple of decades. I'll give an example to show how powerful and how much of a problem this backwards move is. There are many lesbians today who cannot allow it to be said that women can choose to be lesbians. They are entirely under the thrall of biology. Under an interview with me in the online newspaper Lesbian and Gay News about my autobiography Trigger Warning, a commenter is angry that I used the term became a lesbian. She says that surely we all agree now that to say such a thing is homophobic. In other words, lesbians are born, not made. Where does that leave me and all the lesbians I know like me who did become lesbians or choose lesbianism after having encounters with men? We are apparently imposters, or must call ourselves bisexual, though we have had no interest in men for many, many decades, in my case, more than 40 years. The word lesbian, they say, is taken. The corollary to saying that lesbianism is innate is to say that heterosexuality is innate too. To say that previously heterosexual women cannot become lesbians is completely untrue. Back at the time of the WLM, many, many thousands of women abandoned heterosexuality completely and chose to become lesbians. This was revolutionary, I think the most revolutionary aspect of the women's liberation movement. But according to many opinions expressed even among some feminists now, this is not possible. Or even if some women choose to become lesbians, they will never be real ones, because the real ones are biological. So we can only be a pale imitation. What is even more disturbing is that there are some lesbians, some of them feminists, who argue that real lesbians are naturally something called butch, and this is biological too. Biology has come back in relation to lesbianism. But the other way that it is coming back is in the arguments that transvestites and other varieties of male fetishes use to justify their sexual practice. These days, male proponents of all kinds of fetishistic and abusive behavior appeal to biology. They say they are picked by God or some such ineluctable force to be paedophiles or nappy fetishists, and they should be tolerated or even welcomed by society because they cannot help themselves and are just part of the fascinating diversity of biological sexual minorities. And they are gaining considerable success. Feminist theory developed from ideas of social construction, and it isn't possible without them. The way that the masses were kept down historically was to say that their oppression was natural, if not biological. This was taught through religion. It's clearly expressed in the Christian hymn, All Things Bright and Beautiful, which has the line, "The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate, God made them high or lowly, he ordered their estate." When the church was no longer so effective as controlling the people, into its place stepped the sexologists and evolutionary biologists and various male scientists, who stated that the power relations between races and sexes were natural and biological. Male scientists sought to prove that Black people were less intelligent than white people, for instance. One of these was Hans Eysenck, who was at King's College in London. He stated in a 1971 book, "All the evidence to date suggests the overwhelming importance of genetic factors in producing the great variety of intellectual differences which we observe in our culture, and much of the difference observed between certain racial groups." Other male scientists said that women had different kinds of brains from men that made them good at things like monotonous work in factories, for instance. In contrast to this harmful biologism that has always come from scientists and the medical profession, in the middle of the 20th century, there was a revolution in thinking about human behavior, which powered the social justice movements of the 1960s, including feminism. This consisted of the creation of the social sciences of anthropology and sociology, which argued that human behavior was not natural at all, but socially and politically constructed. They argued that sexuality was constructed too. Anthropologists like Margaret Mead in her book, Starting with Coming of Age in Samoa in 1928, and Cleland Ford and Frank Beach in their book, Patterns of Sexual Behavior in 1951, said that their research proved that what was understood as sex and what was seen as acceptable and unacceptable in sex varied hugely across different cultures. Sex was, they said, constructed in and through culture. Two sociologists, John Gagnon and William Simon, developed what was called sexual script theory in a book in 1973, which argued that sex took place according to a script, which was created by the society in which people lived. These men were not pro-feminists. They didn't notice or comment upon the fact that sex is constructed fundamentally within the power relations of male domination and female subordination. They left the manner of construction a mystery. These ideas, however, created a revolution. The idea that race as a concept in which there were naturally different habits and abilities between Black and white people, that was just an invention to secure the power of slave owners, was vital to the civil rights movement. Similarly, the understanding that sex stereotypes, what are now called gender, were socially constructed, was fundamental to the development of the women's liberation movement. That which was socially constructed could be changed, and that allowed the possibility of revolution. There was an explosion of research and activism against socially imposed sex stereotypes in the 1970s. This was a strong movement, and that is why it's such a shock to us veteran feminists in particular, to see that all the old ideas about gender came back in a new form with men who are sexually excited by the subordination that they represent, who reinvented the idea of natural gender and demanded the transgendering of children who play with the wrong toys. Radical feminists oppose any notion that women are naturally feminine and men are naturally masculine. Rather, we argue that femininity is the behavior of subordination and masculinity is the behavior of domination, and these are learned. To give one example, the ways in which men and women use space and hold their bodies, quite apart from what they may wear, how they may speak, and what they may do, is entirely constructed. Little girls are trained to not take up space. They should sit with knees together and not sprawl. Girls must not look directly at men, but have downcast eyes. They should be careful not to touch men, lest they be seen as provocative. They should not be sporty or climb trees, and anyway, that's quite hard in skirts. Boys must do the opposite of all the above. They are trained to man spread, keep their knees apart, engage in the behaviors of power, staring at women, touching women, and harassing women. These behaviors are not natural, but the taught behaviors that represent power relations. Transvestites have many sites on the internet where they can watch videos and train themselves to sit and walk and talk like women, behavior which does not come naturally to them any more than it does to women. We see, as radical feminists, any performance of the genders of power or powerlessness as a problem. But some lesbians, even some who are feminists, refer to themselves as butch today and see butchness as representing some kind of innate lesbianism. This shows the very low ebb in lesbian feminist politics in the present, when there is so little lesbian visibility and lesbian pride that going back to these old forms from the 1950s seems to be the only way that many lesbians can think about who they are. The fact that the rejection of gender, or what we called sex role stereotypes, was so vital to the very possibility of a feminist movement is why many of us old lesbian feminists were horrified to see a rebirth of lesbian butch femme role-playing. In the 1970s, both gay men involved in the gay liberation movement, as well as lesbians involved in the women's liberation movement, entirely rejected what we called sex roles. They were seen as part of our oppression, and imitating the oppressive structures of heterosexual domination and submission that we were fighting our way out of. But there was a backlash against all these ideas. Today, the way in which these revolutionary movements challenged role-playing is long forgotten. There is a cult of role-playing in the US, and in recent years, there have been regular conferences there for femmes, which are very much about the sex industry, and which transvestites attend, pretending to be femme lesbians, and for butches, which valorize masculinity, calling some lesbians masculine of center, whatever that means. One result of the movement back to role-playing is that many lesbians today call themselves butches, and they say this is nothing to do with men and male power. How dare we suggest such a thing, they say. But of course, butch is part of a binary, and the other half of the binary is femme. Butches can't exist all on their own. This binary represents the power relations of heterosexuality and male domination. Today, butch is often promoted as just a word for real lesbians. Who knows where the femmes have gone? There are butch magazines and fashion shows and photo albums. They're all just lesbians, but give themselves this powerful, because it means masculinity, name. The lesbians who call themselves butch look exactly like the lesbian feminists in the 1970s and 80s. But at the time, we saw the word butch as an insult. We wanted nothing to do with men. That is an important reason why we were lesbians. We were women exercising our freedom, throwing off femininity, and having a revolution. I can remember being shocked in the late 1970s at finding that some heterosexual feminists called us lesbians in Leeds, UK, butch, because we had short hair and wore waistcoats. We were horrified. The way the notion of butch has not just returns, but claims to represent lesbianism and dominates areas of lesbian culture is very disturbing. It serves to divide lesbians. And we cannot have a lesbian or feminist revolution if we are divided among ourselves. Instead of all lesbians working together and seeing themselves as having a common cause, lesbians are divided into real ones and imitations, the powerful and the powerless. The butch lesbians are divided from the older generation of lesbians who rejected role-playing, and so on. It is important to understand why the notion of butch has an appeal now that it did not a while back. I suspect it is because the pornification of culture makes womanhood less and less desirable for women who want to be proud and free. Lesbianism is an expression of free womanhood, and it's particularly despised and suppressed right now. There is no lesbian infrastructure to support women having a strong lesbian identity that does not hark back to the anti-lesbian idea that we must somehow be masculine just because we refuse to do the behavior of subordination that is femininity. This might explain why some lesbians have adopted an identity that seems to offer self-respect. But if we accept that masculinity and femininity are socially constructed behaviors that represent the statuses of up and down in a hierarchy, then the notion of butchness needs to be questioned, just as much as any other forms of sex stereotyping or gender do. I now want to talk about the way that sexuality generally is constructed out of the relations of male domination. The sex of male domination, it takes the form of eroticizing women's subordination and men's domination. The sexologists, sex therapists, and pornographers who construct sex in the present define sex as penis in vagina sexual intercourse. This practice symbolizes the power relations of male domination. It's an activity in which the organ which signifies a man's membership of the male sex caste is used to penetrate the genitals that signify a woman's membership of the subordinate sex caste. It's the activity which builds and maintains a man's sense of his status and woman's sense of her subordinate status. Sexual behavior is not natural, but heavily and determinedly politically constructed. Where once it was constructed by religion, it's now constructed by two very powerful and influential authorities: sexology, the science of sex and its practical offshoot, sex therapy, and the sex industry, mainly pornography, which is the main, if not only, sex education tool of generations of boys in the present. The act of penis in vagina sex itself is learnt. There is a great example of this in the sexological literature, of a couple coming to see a doctor because the woman was not getting pregnant. The problem was that the man was penetrating the woman's belly button. He knew he had to penetrate something, but he had no idea what. That problem would not arise today. Boys and men consume a relentless diet of women being penetrated with penises every which way. They know what they are supposed to do. The founding fathers of sexology prescribed what men should do and how women should react. In the early 20th century, the British sexologist Henry Havelock Ellis explained that sex must take place in the form of man on top and woman on the bottom, penis in vagina sexual intercourse. The man should be active and the woman passive. Her body the violin, he said, and his hand the bow. He said that men naturally like to play the role of hunter. He did not believe in rape and thought women lied about it. Women were naturally masochistic, he said. The proof was that a woman's face, when she has an orgasm, is just like the rictus of pain when a woman's clitoris is cut off by a doctor to stop her masturbating, something which was done quite a bit at that time. Penis in vagina sexual intercourse is a practice that is very problematic for women, so it does need to be imposed with considerable force and pressure. It's not well related to women's sexual pleasure. It requires the technologization of women's bodies to prevent pregnancy. It carries the risk of sexually transmitted diseases, and it symbolizes dominant submissive relations. It is often very painful, particularly after menopause, when women have to anoint themselves with lubricants to allow access. It's the only sexual activity which impregnates women. But because of its symbolic and actual advantages, to men, it remains what is seen as sex. If it were not enforced upon women as strongly as it is, it does seem likely that much less of it would happen. And I would like to see that happen as a social experiment. I think that would be quite interesting. Now, the construction of women's sexuality is generally around masochism. Women's sexual feelings are not natural, but they are socially constructed. Many women experience masochistic fantasies, i.e., They eroticize their own subordination. This is not natural. Women eroticize their own subordination because in heterosexuality they have nothing else to eroticize. They do not have equality to eroticize or power to eroticize. They do not usually have much chance to work out their own sexuality because they will experience male sexual coercion from childhood onwards, even if they escape actually being raped. Men, on the other hand, eroticize domination. This is clear from their pornography, which mostly involves forms of violence, cruelty, and humiliation towards women, and trains men to see this as just what sex is. The pornography of today goes a great deal further than the sexologists of yesteryear were prepared to go in the extremes of abuse towards women. Sex therapy uses pornography to teach women what to do and normalizes men's sexual violent practices. Teen Vogue teaches girl children how to do anal sex, not because it is anything to do with girls' pleasure. In fact, girls find it painful, but because men want to do this, and so much of porn includes it as the way for men to be men. Women's Health magazine, like so many popular women's magazines today, has an article on how choking, a practice used in 1/4 of all killings of women in the UK, can be fun. The objective of feminism has to be the eroticizing of equality. That, as I always say when talking of this, sounds about as sexy to many as a cold rice pudding. That's because the whole culture in pornified male-dominated societies is geared to finding only violations of consent and the operation of power exciting. There can be no success for feminism while sex continues to take the form of the eroticizing of women's subordination. We need to change this. Some will say, but surely we can't change our sexual fantasies. They are just who we are. Not so, of course. We can be furious that the power relations of male domination have entered our heads and affected something that seems so personal. And that fury can enable us to change the sexual contents of our heads. There's nothing inevitable about it. Back in the early 80s, when sadomasochism was being propelled into the lesbian community here in the UK from its origins in the US, some of us would conduct workshops at conferences on how to change sexual fantasies. We would talk about ridiculous fantasies and roar with laughter at them. Laughter is a good disinfectant. Laughter and sadomasochism really do not mix well. Sexual fantasies can certainly be changed or abandoned altogether as undermining and unhelpful. I now want to look at the question of whether heterosexuality and homosexuality are biologically or socially constructed. The sexologists, the scientists of sex, are still heavily invested in biological explanations for sexual behavior. They say, of course, that sexual orientation is biological. They carry out research desperately trying to find the gene or area of the brain that causes people to be lesbian or gay. The research is based on the idea that heterosexuality is natural and that they, the scientists, will be able to find some deviation, some fault that can cause people to be abnormal. Their work has been roundly debunked. There are no biological markers that have been found for sexual behavior. They don't look for the causes of heterosexuality because that's natural. They look for what must have gone wrong. Their zeal is religious, and they will brook no arguments against biology, though their theories are more and more wild and they can find nothing to back them up. The less evidence there is, the wilder they become. The gay sexologist James Cantor thinks that homosexuality is a biological mistake. He says that the idea that men are essentially born gay or straight is now pretty much taken for granted. Not so in feminism. His mentor was Ray Blanchard, who has said sensible things to say about transvestism. Blanchard, however, apparently figured out that homosexuality in men follows from interactions before birth between male fetuses and the immune system of the mother. And it happens particularly where the man has a number of older brothers, because the greater number of male fetuses has a greater effect on the mother's immune system. Of course, none of this works for lesbians, and of course, they never do research on lesbians. James Cantor and Ray Blanchard have decided that paedophilia is the result of faulty biology too. Cantor says that paedophiles show important differences from non-paedophiles, and so paedophilia is an innate and probably immutable feature. People, he says, do not choose to be sexually attracted to children. Actually, women don't choose to be sexually attracted to children and do not abuse them. It is these men who have ordained that heterosexuality is innate and that homosexuality is a biological mistake. Feminists, though, have never subscribed to these increasingly bizarre ideas. We say that heterosexuality itself is a social construction. The sexologists never sought an explanation for lesbianism. And lesbians have always been a thorn in the side for these scientists because they don't fit into any of their theories or any of their research. Lesbian feminists argue that heterosexuality is an institution rather than a sexual preference. Saying that it is an institution means that it goes far beyond just an attraction to persons of the opposite sex, but it's socially and politically constructed to provide a means of extracting women's unpaid labor and controlling women under the power of individual men and families. Male domination is founded upon the possession of use of women's bodies in relationships, which in most part of the world and most of history were forced upon girls and women. Heterosexuality is necessary to male domination because it's the foundation of men's power, and women are indentured into it as children in child marriage, more reasonably called child sexual slavery, or bought, sold, and exchanged in the West. Only in forced marriage and polygamy. Only in certain cultures in the West can women be said to choose to enter heterosexuality. The forms of unpaid labor that men acquire are sexual servicing, in which women are used routinely in sex they do not want but cannot say no to, domestic labor, emotional labor, the production and rearing of children. All of this is free. This unpaid labor is the basis of the global economy, which could not survive without it. It's an affirmative action program for men, which is essential to their rule. It is a slave system because women earn nothing except the destruction of their opportunities. This is such a necessary foundation for the whole economic and political system of male domination that it cannot be left to chance or choice. For all these reasons, heterosexuality is, as the lesbian feminist theorist Adrienne Rich said, compulsory. The forces that propel women into heterosexuality include the heterosexualization of the entire culture, pressure from within families, the insistent pressure of boys and men from childhood, which requires girls and women to be sexually available, rape and other forms of sexual violence, the erasure of lesbians from culture taking place now through the transgendering of lesbians, and the exclusion of use of the lesbian word. One of the pressures comes from those within the lesbian community now, who seek to disown and exclude women like me and other feminists, who say it's possible to choose to be lesbians. Forces include the absence of any lesbian infrastructure to support girls and women becoming lesbians within their schools or wider society. There's little or no lesbian literature, theatre, films, TV series. There are no longer, as once there were, lesbian centres, bars and clubs. There are no lesbian groups that do not have transvestites in them, trying to get sexual access to lesbians. There is no infrastructure at all. We made our own in the 70s and 80s, and it was grand, but it's all been dismantled and demolished. Nobody today could become a lesbian just because they saw a lesbian universe that was so attractive they just plunged in, as many of us did at one time. Even the dating apps are dominated by transvestites. But lesbianism has huge advantages, which suggests that great forces of power are required to force women into heterosexuality. After all, relating to someone with the same body is likely to be more sexually satisfying. There is unlikely to be coercion into unwanted sex in which women lie there being used while thinking of the next day's housework. Childcare and housework are likely to be shared, and there is research to show this. There is no need for protection against unwanted pregnancy or most sexually transmitted diseases because they come from the penis. There is much less chance of violence and abuse. There is much greater chance of having interests in common and a close companionship with someone who is not trained from birth to have different and conflicting interests. Research suggests that men who marry or live in heterosexual relationships are healthier, happier, and live longer than those who do not. The opposite is the case for women. So this is a very attractive picture of lesbianism, and there has to be the exercise of considerable force to ensure that women do not choose to be lesbians. The analysis of heterosexuality as compulsory and as a political institution was created by lesbian feminists in the 1970s and 80s, most of whom had made a political and personal choice to be lesbians. It was a personal choice because it was about the pursuit of happiness. It was a political choice because we considered that women who withdrew from men to put all their energies into each other, the solution, rather than men, the problem, would be much better able to work for the overthrow of male domination. We would be putting all our energies into women and into the revolution. We hoped to undermine the institution of heterosexuality. This was a hugely revolutionary development. With the women who had been lesbians all along, we created a culture and community that was very exciting and an instrument of change. This has been swept away in a massive anti-feminist and anti-lesbian backlash. Part of that backlash is the fury of some mostly younger lesbians today at the very idea of political lesbianism. They see it as homophobic to say that lesbian is not innate, biological, and fixed at birth. But this idea and the anti-feminist and anti-lesbian politics that it represents are the product of a particular stage in history. Women's ideas about what lesbianism is and how they became lesbians change according to wider historical forces. A student of mine, Loreen Gottschalk, researched what women in 3 different cohorts thought about the origins of their lesbianism. Women who came out as lesbians in the 1970s mostly said they chose to be lesbians. Women who came out in the 1980s were equally balanced between those who said they chose and those who thought it was biology. Women who came out in the 1990s mostly thought it was biology. Women think about themselves and what they do in the language and concepts available to them at the time. Now we are in a very biologistic time, where even talking of becoming a lesbian is seen by some as heresy. In order to create a strong and effective lesbian and feminist revolution, we need to be consistent in our understanding of how sex stereotyping or gender, whether that of lesbian role-playing or in heterosexuality, is constructed, and how heterosexuality is constructed too. Arguments as to innateness and biology are designed to prevent criticism, prevent the developments of ideas, and prevent revolutionary change. Thank you. Jess Williams says, in the last seminar, the webinar she saw me on, I talked about the history of gender identity and that the men that needed to make people see them differently connected it with children to make it seem less devious. Yes, that's absolutely right. It's the adult transgenders who have campaigned to transgender children. There's no question whatsoever. Children didn't do it themselves. It's the adult men who campaigned to transgender children because they wanted to make it look as if it wasn't a sexual fetish, which in fact it is. So they are responsible for that. As Helen says, are we actually moving from biological essentialism that anti-feminists use to gendered essentialism that states we can define gender with gender expressions? I see them as very similar, and really, I'm not sure about the difference there. Sheila, do you think, this is Denise McKenna, that one very important thing women should be fighting for is the history of feminism be taught on a compulsory basis in schools? That would be lovely, but which version of the history of feminism is going to be taught? That is the question, I think. But yes, of course, there should be feminism being taught in schools. I think there was, when I was in Australia, there was once a sort of end of school qualification. One of the subjects was feminism. They got rid of that a few years ago. Christina says, if you could choose to include 3 topics in sex ed for teenagers, which topics and which books? All I can say in shortened form is that what children need to be taught is, first of all, they may or may not wish to be sexual. Only if they decide that they wish to be sexual, do they have to choose whether they want to be sexual simply with themselves, which is in the form of self-stimulation, or they wish to be sexual with other persons. They, of course, have none of these choices and they're not taught any of them. If they wish to be sexual with other persons, would they like to choose persons of the same or the opposite sex? All of the advantages of lesbianism at this point need to be taught very, very clearly. You can imagine this. And even the clitoris might need to be taught. That would be good. And then should they actually choose men, even though lesbianism is so obviously a superior choice, particularly at this stage in history, then they might need to choose which particular sexual practice they would wish to engage in. There is no choice, of course. They will be expected to do penis in vagina sexual intercourse. If they are forced to, or they do choose penis in vagina sexual intercourse, then there should be a choice as to whether they are going to contracept or not. There is no choice about that most of the time, of course, in most countries in the world. If they are able to, if the contraception fails, then they're in a position as having to decide whether or not they need an abortion. I always say all of this, and I used to teach it to my students, because people talk about abortion as if this was something straightforward. Women can choose abortion. Abortion is the end of a process in which women and girls have had no choices in anything whatsoever at all. Choice would be really nice, but the idea of teaching that, I mean, it's kind of extraordinary. That's not going to happen. Then somebody who's anonymous says, Sheila, what is your opinion on the idea that all humans are potentially bisexual, the potential to be attracted to either sex? Yes, I guess I do think that. I do not think that at the moment this is helpful, because actually we're in a situation where heterosexuality is totally enforced and lesbianism is the really sensible, revolutionary and practical solution at this time in terms of women's happiness and women's possibilities. It's vaguely possible to imagine a different world, but I don't think we're going to see it in hundreds of years. So I don't think we need to even think about that possibility, because that's not going to happen soon. Jess Williams says, and how do you think we can talk about political lesbianism more in gender critical and radfem spaces without it going badly? I don't know, because I get an enormous amount of backlash, as you know, for the sort of things that I say, being told that I'm not really a lesbian, not a real one, I'm a bisexual, etc., etc. Having women lying on the floor where they give talks calling me a CUNT and shouting that I'm not a lesbian. I have all of that. And so, yes, but that shows the backlash and the shit that you get for talking about these things shows how crucially important it is. We're talking about something absolutely fundamental here, or there would not be so much strife.